Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Our guest today is Richard Goldberg, who is going to bring us the latest details on an unfortunately long-standing problem, Iran and its nuclear ambitions. I know we've done Iran before, and Rich has been our guest before, but given the state of things and the threats from Iran and the policies of the US government, it is time to do it again. I'm pleased to know that a lot of you sort of agree with our thinking because we have a very large audience today. Before we get to Richard, here is your JPC commercial. We were established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can see our insight articles, In Focus Quarterly, our magazine, our blog In Context, and the Alliance Tracker and Frontline Defense blogs. There's a lot of good information on the website, and I'm happy to say it is free for access. The winter issue of In Focus, by the way, is out. It is on China. We had some great authors. I encourage you to go to the website, download the In Focus magazine, and see what we've got. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defenses for both countries. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, we've been pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including China, virus and other, Israel, including the Abraham Accords, but not only, domestic security, anti-Semitism, the US defense budget, and the Supreme Court. And Turkey last week. We had a great program with Aykan Erdemir on Turkey, which allows me also to say that you can find previous webinars on our website as well. Download them and enjoy. Today, we're talking about the Vienna negotiations and the Biden administration's stated desire to reach a new agreement with Iran. And as I said before, we've done sanctions before, we've done Iran before, and we've had Rich Goldberg with us before, including Rich Goldberg was the first of our webinar guests, February 3rd, 2000. So it's been a while, but the growing threat and the constellation of countries in Vienna make it clear that we have to do it again. And there is no one better than Rich Goldberg to do it. Let me remind you, you are muted, but you can send questions during the program to the Q&A function on your screen. Let me introduce Rich Goldberg formally. He is Senior Advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. In 2019 and 2020, he was the Director for Countering Iranian Weapons of Mass Destruction at the National Security Council. He previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois. And he was in that position with Mr. Kirk when he was a congressman as well. As a member of Mark Kirk's staff, Rich drafted and negotiated legislation promoting human rights in Iran and democracy, including sanctions targeting entities that provide the government with the tools of repression. And I just saw this morning that the Iranian government has sentenced a championship boxer to death for participating in a peaceful protest against domestic corruption in Iran. We need those sanctions. And by the way, we need to remember the domestic victims, including Mohammed Javad, the boxer. This is a good place to remember that not everything that Iran does that's bad is nuclear. A lot of what Iran does that's bad is domestic. As staff associate for the House Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, Rich Goldberg worked on issues related to US foreign assistance, including foreign military financing, international security assistance, and international peacekeeping missions. He was also a founding staff director of the House US-China Working Group, and among the first Americans ever to visit China's Human Space Launch Center. I love that one. That's just sort of out of the Iran world, but that's a good one. A leader in efforts to expand U.S. missile defense cooperation with Israel, he also played a key role in U.S. funding for the Arrow 3 program, Iron Dome, and the deployment of an advanced missile defense radar in the Negev Desert for use by the United States. And I think, Rich, that's where we met in those days of early U.S.-Israel defense cooperation. Wherever he worked, Rich Goldberg has been the architect of some of the toughest sanctions imposed on the Islamic Republic of Iran, and his maximum sanctions campaign had a major impact on Iran's internal and external malign capabilities. So let's see where we are now. Rich Goldberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me back. It's an honor to be back. I remember being an inaugural guest in the series just a couple of years ago, and I wish we could change topics to something rosy and talk about what has come after the fall of the Islamic Republic of Iran and beautiful democracy and human rights respect in that country, cessation of the sponsorship of terrorism, stop to the export of missiles and weapons, stop to nuclear ambition threats to wipe out our allies, ultimately the United States. But here we are today, and the story of the last year is not a good one, unfortunately. We saw the White House try to trot out a new set of talking points last week, perhaps an expectation of something not so good coming in the news soon from Vienna. And those talking points were out of the blue. They said, whatever happens with Iran today is because of the past administration and because of their maximum pressure, because of the decision to leave the Iran nuclear deal. Everything would be great today if we just had stayed in the Iran nuclear deal, and the results that we will get out of Vienna are not our fault, the Biden administration, but the previous administration's fault. The kind of statement that could have sold in a marketing sort of way, a PR spin in January or February or March or even April of last year, early in a new administration's term. But 1 year into office, with policy decision after policy decision being made, it is all but impossible for the White House to pass the buck at this point, because it's their Iran policy that has been pursued for the last year, not the previous administrations. About a year ago, I wrote an op-ed with my colleague at FDD, Mark Dubowitz, in Foreign Policy, in which we urged President-elect Biden at the time not to come into office to fulfill this pledge from his campaign and what he had talked about with the New York Times, if you recall, back in December of 2020, that his goal was going to be to return to the JCPOA, return to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, supposedly to be able to negotiate a longer and stronger agreement once back in compliance with the JCPOA. All with full knowledge that the JCPOA had already started to expire. In 2020, we had the arms embargo lifting pursuant to the Security Council resolution. 2023, missile sanctions, missile restrictions internationally are scheduled to lift. 2024 and beyond, you start having a lot of nuclear restrictions lifting. And in fact, everything you see Iran do today, all the way enrichment up to 60%, the use of advanced centrifuges, using different facilities, all of it is actually allowed ultimately under the Iran nuclear deal by 2031 and beyond. They can actually go all the way to weapons grade uranium enrichment under the nuclear deal. And remember, all of this knowing that the nuclear deal didn't cover many things that were very critical to actually preventing Iran from nuclear weapons capabilities in the future. No coverage in the deal with respect to Iran's research and development and testing of nuclear capable ballistic and cruise missiles as they continue to advance that program. And no coverage of their sponsorship of terrorism, obviously, and no full accounting, most importantly and fundamentally, of all of their nuclear activities, past and present, even with information in front of us that was sending alarm bells in 2015 from the Parchin military complex and previous information we had seen as well, that there was still some clandestine nuclear activities inside Iran that we could never fully account for, which meant that any nuclear deal was built on deceit. Well, we came in January of 2021, And instead of taking our advice not to go back to the Iran nuclear deal, but instead to use the incredible historic leverage that the Biden administration was inheriting to drive a better agreement, that advice was ignored. And so what we saw was, beginning in late January of a year ago, the abandonment of maximum pressure and the adoption of what I like to call maximum deference. Some like to call it maximum carrots, where the approach was, we will try to lure Iran back to the table, back to the old JCPOA, by holding back on sanctions enforcement, by loosening our sanctions wherever we can without being burned politically on Capitol Hill. We will continue to turn a blind eye to military activities carried out by Iran, by the IRGC, against US forces in the region and against our allies, whether it's Gulf allies or Israel. And we will also stop putting pressure on Iran at the IAEA in Vienna, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and stop pressing for Iran to account for undeclared nuclear activities and materials that the IAEA had discovered back in 2019 when it visited a site and found nuclear material that remains unaccounted for, and apparently has gone to additional sites, all undeclared to the IAEA, and found more evidence of nuclear material at these additional sites as well. And so what did we see throughout the year? We saw immediately the rescinding of the foreign terrorist organization designation of the Houthis in Yemen, an Iran-sponsored, Iran-backed terrorist organization. Well, just this week, we continue to see the evidence, unfortunately, of that decision, empowering Iran, even at the negotiating table in Vienna, to launch an incredibly spectacular attack against the UAE and Abu Dhabi. And we'll see exactly, as the evidence continues to grow, what Iran's role in that attack was. But we saw immediately the March board meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency come. Our European allies were set to press forward with a censure resolution of Iran to say, we're going to refer you to the Security Council soon if you don't come clean on this undeclared nuclear activity and material. And immediately the Biden administration reportedly pulled its allies back and said, no censure resolutions, no more resolutions at the Board of Governors of the IAEA. We're not going to do anything provocative to the Iranians. Early March, as attacks against US forces continued in Iraq, later on in Syria, one of those attacks ended up killing a contractor who died after the attack. And there was no military response to that attack. In fact, for months, we would later learn, there were constant UAV missile attacks, rocket attacks against US interests in Iraq that went completely unresponded to by the US military at the White House's direction, giving a complete, terribly weak signal to the leadership in Tehran that it could run the table in the region and potentially at the nuclear table in Vienna as well. But we also saw the relaxing of US sanctions against Iran. It's not just that the Biden administration has not enforced economic sanctions against Iran for an entire year. That's bad enough because the non-enforcement of sanctions is sanctions relief. Just look at the skyrocketing exports of oil to China that have gone on under this administration over the last year without any pushback, without any crackdown. Also in the non-oil exports as well, they get a little less attention. But in fact, there was a license issued to allow Iran more access to its frozen funds overseas so it could repay its debts and avoid a balance of payments crisis, billions of dollars. There was an actual formal waiver issued to allow Iran, again, more relaxed access to those funds. There was even just in the last couple of weeks, another license at the beginning of the year issued for Iran to repay additional debts to different places. The opposition to an IMF emergency loan to Iran was dropped by this administration. And so there was an injection of cash and a rollback of restrictions on access to cash that allowed the regime not just to survive, but in fact to stabilize and improve its economic prospects going forward. And so on the economic front, on the political front, on the military front, all of the key lines of effort of pressure against Iran were dropped and abandoned in this hope that because we were just nice to them, the Iranians would say, great, we'll come back into compliance with the old JCPOA. What did the Iranians do? They said, wow, we can do all this stuff, and your starting point for a negotiation is the old JCPOA. Well, we're going to turn the tables on you, and we're going to increase the ante. And so, in fact, completely predictably, despite months-long calls for the administration to change course and revert to some sort of pressure tactic against the regime, we now sit in Vienna today, reportedly, with the possibility that the administration will agree to something even worse than the JCPOA. Remember, just returning to the JCPOA and lifting sanctions is bad enough. This is a deal that expires, is already expired. This is a deal that allows Iran to do everything you see it do today, only completely legitimately under cover of a Security Council resolution. And the minute you lift sanctions, your leverage is gone. There is no longer and stronger deal after you lift sanctions. That's a fantasy. Meanwhile, the snapback, the potential to reimpose all those restrictions from the Security Council, something the Trump administration tried to do in late 2020. By the way, the Biden administration, one of its first actions, sending a letter to the Security Council rescinding that snapback decision of the Trump administration. The snapback can only occur until 2025 under the Iran deal. Then there's no more snapback. Iran gets to keep all the sunsets through 2031 and beyond. And so going back to the deal is a terrible idea. That itself is granting Iran the pathways to nuclear weapons in the future. What we're about to see is something even worse, something nobody could have fathomed, where Iran gets more money and gets to keep more of its nuclear infrastructure that has been built up. Remember, this is unbelievable. The administration came in having opposed the snapback of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 and pulling back the Trump administration snapback because it felt that that was misguided and that they could get Iran back into compliance with the JCPOA even after exceeding their enrichment stockpile, their heavy water stockpile, and reopening the Fordo underground facility and testing advanced centrifuges there as well. Instead of reacting when Iran, right before Inauguration Day, escalated its enrichment to 20% enriched uranium from its low enriched uranium standard under the Biden administration, there again was no reaction when Biden came in. We're still going to try to induce Iran back to the agreement. We're not going to pressure them at the IAEA. No sanctions enforcement. What did Iran do? They escalated their nuclear program further. They went from 20%, which had been a real red alarm, five-alarm fire for the international community just several years ago prior to the JCPOA. They went to 60% enrichment, just a stone's throw away from weapons-grade uranium, as if that wouldn't be the trigger for the snapback of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 and a return to full enforcement of US sanctions. They started producing uranium metal, key component of nuclear weapons. They started limiting access to the IAEA to key sites. To this day, they are not allowing the IAEA to take the footage of video cameras that they have set up for inspections and verification at key sites and look at the footage. They can only service the video cameras to make sure the footage is still being recorded for future use. That's what's happening today. And no talk of snapback, no move to reimpose sanctions, no move to enforce US sanctions alone, no censure at the IAEA. By the way, that's the overt enrichment, right? The entire time they're still blocking the IAEA from any access to information about these undeclared sites, materials, and activities that underlie our concerns about what Iran is doing inside its country. And instead, Iran has now moved the football all the way down the field. They were backed up against their own goal line when they came in 2021, down to $4 billion in accessible foreign exchange reserves, according to the IMF. Think about that, $4 billion in accessible foreign exchange reserves at the end of 2020. Pressure at the IAEA, not an expanded nuclear program like they have today. And they went an entire year, drove the length of the football field to our red zone, putting them on the threshold of nuclear weapons, the threshold of a nuclear weapons state, if they go to weapons-grade uranium and were ever to attempt a breakout. with an improved economy, no political pressure, no military deterrence whatsoever. As if yesterday's press conference signaling Putin could invade Ukraine following the debacle of Afghanistan hasn't eroded our military deterrence against the supreme leader enough. And now we sit in Vienna waiting to see if the United States will agree to lift sanctions in exchange for Iran keeping its nuclear gains even beyond the terrible limits of the JCPOA. A less for more deal, where Iran gives up even less than the JCPOA and gets more in return in the form of sanctions relief. That's what's on the table today. And so there is going to be a lot of discussion going forward about what does that mean for potential military options out of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in the months ahead. What does this mean for the region to have Iran accepted potentially as a nuclear weapons threshold state? What does that mean for US national security long term? For this regime to have no restrictions on its development of longer range missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons, while its nuclear infrastructure continues to expand. It gets to keep all of these gains from the last year. Oh, and by the way, no snapback of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which means all of that happens and Iran gets to keep the sunsets of key international restrictions, so that all it's doing today becomes perfectly legitimate in just a couple of years. And at some point, they feel comfortable to cross the Rubicon and actually go nuclear. So it's a bleak picture today. There are opportunities for Congress on a bipartisan basis to push back. What we're hearing about in Vienna would be subject, or at least should be subject if the president follows the law, to the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which was passed back in 2015. That means that the agreement would have to be submitted by the White House to Congress for review before any sanctions could be lifted, and the potential for resolutions of disapproval to be in order. Obviously, we saw back in 2015, even with a Republican-controlled Senate, that was very difficult to happen. The idea that the onus is on Congress to reject the agreement, and potentially, even if you could get through both chambers, have to override the veto of a president, rather than this being a treaty that gets submitted to the US Senate for ratification, which it should be. But still, that means Congress has the right to review this. They need to have that time because we need to be able to show the American people what is in this agreement and whether or not it is good for our national security or not, and then have people vote their conscience on whether or not they believe this is the right move for US national security. We also see a lot of people, primarily in the Republican caucuses, future candidates for president perhaps, pledging that no matter what comes out of Vienna, if sanctions are lifted, they will be reimposed as soon as Republicans have the votes in Congress or a new president is in the White House, which is important for market deterrence as companies consider whether or not they would consider going back to Iran even with sanctions lifted. There's also the families of American victims of terrorism who are speaking out. Just last week, 1,200 families of Gold Star families of victims of Iranian terrorism. These are our US soldiers who were killed in Iraq by IRGC, EFPs, and IEDs. They wrote a letter to the president, very powerful letter. NBC News reported it last week, that said, Mr. President, please do not lift sanctions on Iran. Please do not give them access to these billions of dollars sitting in South Korea and Japan and Iraq and elsewhere until they have used that money to pay the judgments that have been found in federal court against them for killing our sons and daughters. That is something the president needs to respond to. The White House has been silent so far. Congress needs to respond to that as well. Happy to talk about other options in Q&A, but that's sort of the framework right now. There's things that states and local governments can do to respond as well. There are things that Congress can do, but ultimately, obviously, we know the president has primary jurisdiction and prerogative in foreign policy. And that's why we are waiting with bated breath on what may come out of Vienna in the coming days.
Thank you, Rich. Not a happy picture. Before we get to Q&A, we have lots of good questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One of our listeners asked that we please remind viewers that the atomic weapons that the US dropped on Japan in World War II were enriched to 60 to 63%. So bombs without what we call today weapons grade uranium can also do a lot of damage. So keep in mind that they're already in a place where they can do a lot of damage. Thank you to the listener for that. China. So China's been buying Iranian oil, which makes China happy. They need imported oil, and it makes Iran happy because there's a lot of money. And China is sitting in Vienna in the room with Russia, with some of our European allies, and Iran, and we're on the outside. Have Chinese purchases of Iranian oil inclined China to take Iran's side inside the room? And how would we know?
Well, I think China has taken Iran's side for years, more or less. I think the decision at a leadership level in China to embark on a very hostile relationship with the United States under Xi Jinping is simply, this is one of the symptoms of a larger strategy going on to disrupt US dominance throughout the world, and to move from an ambition of being an East Asia power to being a global power that threatens the United States in every avenue. The Middle East being one of them. And so we saw shortly after the Iran nuclear deal was signed and implemented, I shouldn't say signed, it was actually never a signed document, but after it was implemented back in 2016, the leader of China came to Iran, visited, and said, let's do a 25-year big deal that you've heard about over the last couple of years. This MOU, this big plan for Chinese investment and infrastructure in exchange for access to Iranian oil and other minerals and exports, and potential for, who knows, in the future, a port for China in Iran, other sorts of hubs. This was something that was planned upon on the basis of US sanctions being lifted, because that's the easiest way for China to be able to expand their trade and investment and infrastructure development in the Middle East and in Iran. Iran is simply one of many stops on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, US sanctions being in place means a lot of that vision can't actually happen. Ultimately, China does fear for US sanctions, financial sanctions, hitting their state-owned enterprises and their state-owned banks. We have seen Chinese behavior in the past respond to the threat of US sanctions on top-level state-owned enterprises. And so we shouldn't be, view that somehow China was with us at one point and they weren't with us. China acts in its own interests. They want a diversified source of oil and energy. They are a customer of Saudi Arabia, and they're a customer of Iran. And so even though the Saudis had come to them and said, we will replace Iranian oil barrel for barrel if you just simply comply with US sanctions, what they did was they took their time to figure out how to continue a relationship with Iran below the surface of state-owned enterprises, so that these illicit cargoes that are going are very difficult to track and understand who's behind them. They're going to irregular ports of China. They're sometimes being kept off shore, simply moored until they're brought aboard another ship, brought to shore, and then moved out by truck somewhere. Hard to track who is actually in charge of it, what bank is involved in a transaction. Many, many years ago, we saw one bank that was set up, a shell bank out in Wuhan, that was established to try to have some sort of way around US sanctions. That got hit under the Obama administration. Ultimately, we were able to dig in and find out who the parent companies were, who was backing, who was capitalizing. As we see, nothing in China can really happen without government permission. And at some point, if you climb the ladder, there is a state-owned enterprise. And so it's all about our willingness to continue to investigate and climb that ladder until we find who is actually behind this, backing it, giving the money for these transactions. And if you get there and you threaten the sanctions, the Chinese ultimately do back down because they have their own economic concerns. So in the end, yes, we have seen the rise in Chinese imports from Iran because of our unwillingness as an administration, as a country, to crack down on those imports, to climb that ladder, to threaten sanctions against top-level state-owned enterprises, in China. And so they take advantage of that. They see the opportunity, if the US lifts sanctions, to expand the Belt and Road Initiative in Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East, to have a foothold, to be able to project their power in the Middle East from another country. And so they have an interest in seeing sanctions lifted. I'll add one more point. The Defense Department, in their annual military power report, has reported to Congress now for several years, China, in addition to Russia, want to sell arms to Iran. And if the arms embargo is recognized as having expired at the United Nations, and if the United States offers to rescind the executive order that the former president issued to back up our snapback claim to relieve sanctions threats from China and Russia if they do transfer arms to Iran, this is a demand, by the way, of the Iranians, then we will see a new market for Chinese arms sales as well, which is one of the things they are looking for.
Funded, of course, by the sale of Iranian oil, which we don't want them to sell. So I'm going to try to put together a number of questions here. So you get to take a deep breath and a drink of your coffee. A number of people have asked the question, so now what? So what should we be doing? You've talked about the restoration of sanctions and the ability to control what goes on through sanctions. So I would assume that one thing you would want is the restoration of sanctions. But somebody else raised the question of preemption. And Israelis have talked, and in fact, official Israelis have talked about Israel's unwillingness to see Iran as a nuclear power and reserving the right to take preemptive action should that threat become intolerable to the state of Israel. So the question becomes twofold. Number one, does it help the United States in Vienna for people to know that Israel may have a different policy than the United States, and that preemption is on somebody's list of things to do, and Israel has not only the willingness, but the ability to wreak destruction in parts of Iran? Or, and here's adding in another question, does the United States ever consider preemption or the ability to preempt a possible US policy for the future? So you've got sanctions, preemption by Israel, preemption by the United States, all as a picture.
Yeah, these are great questions. I'll preface by saying nobody wants to have to go to war. Nobody wants to attack any country. Nobody wants to ultimately have to use military force. These are tactics of last resort to achieve US national security interests if we must, if diplomacy fails. But I also know that diplomacy has no chance of succeeding if you are unwilling to threaten the use of force, if you have no military deterrence in effect. If the other side believes you will never actually use force, why would they ever capitulate at the table unless they are facing such dire economic consequences that even with the absence of a threat of force, they would still capitulate? That being said, the United States today has no deterrent against Iran in effect. I think that that is a safe statement to make. That deterrent was eroded throughout the last year based on the attacks against US forces that went without response. The president did respond twice over the last year, both times against non-Iranian militias funded by Iran in areas that would not be threatening low priority facilities or personnel, never going after the IRGC commanders on the field who were giving the orders to strike Americans. That eroded our military deterrent. The Afghanistan withdrawal, looking the other way and allowing the Taliban to march on Kabul, eroded our military deterrent, not just with Iran, obviously, but with Russia and with China. What is happening today with Russia and Ukraine, what we saw in the press conference yesterday, again, continues to erode that military deterrent. And the fact the United States is unwilling to unequivocally say they are prepared to use military force and will is also something that affects us in the diplomacy with Tehran. Now you'd say, well, they came around and they finally said, we're considering other options. And then finally, Tony Blinken said, all options are on the table. Well, here's the problem. Just a couple of weeks ago, it was reported that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was considering the snapback of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 as a response to Iran threatening that they would enrich uranium at weapons grade levels, 90%. Which is to say, we did not have, as a policy of the US government, a military red line for the enrichment of uranium to weapons grade level by Iran, and don't today. The idea that we would be threatening a political response to such a incredibly threatening military, not civilian, military action by Iran to go to weapons grade uranium enrichment means that we do not currently have the threat of US military force against Iran, and likely would not, even if it went to detonation.
So
That would take a statement by the US government. Now for Israel, that means they have to have a bottom line, and they have to speak very clearly about their willingness. But they can't just speak clearly, they're going to have to take actions. And this is a new Israeli government. You could argue back and forth whether Bibi Netanyahu had the credibility of his constant threats of military force after never actually following through on them for many, many years. The counter argument to that is he did authorize a lot of things that did a lot of interesting things to Iran in the military space, in the covert space, and the constant attacks and responses attacking IRGC forces in Syria among them. This government needs to, in Israel, demonstrate its willingness to use force. I get a little bit concerned by gimmickry when you see we're putting into the Knesset budget more dollars to plan a strike against Iran. That's an interesting way of saying we're not prepared to strike Iran today, which I'm not sure I truly believe is the actual operational capability of the IAF today. You also see other statements of, well, we could consider, there's internal divisions supposedly reportedly between military intelligence and military commanders who want to buy more time and might concede something of an interim agreement with Iran compared to the political leadership saying that should be off the table. Again, the question has to be for the Israelis, do you have the capabilities to strike Iran? And if you do, you need to make very clear that you are willing to do that at a time of your choosing. Because if Israel is signaling that they can't attack Iran today, and America is attacking, they won't attack Iran today, it doesn't really matter what we're negotiating with the Iranians. They will take that signal and move forward.
on the other hand, if the United States government doesn't have the ability to do this, and as you say, we probably don't, isn't it helpful to the United States to think that Israel would be our, I don't want to say this because I never liked the idea that Israel would take military action on our behalf. They would take military action and should take only on their own behalf and behalf of their own security. But isn't it like having a safeguard to think that they could do what we could not do? Could that help us?
Well, it helps the world if Israel is willing to do what needs to be done if great powers are unwilling to act in the face of great danger to their own national security. And so it is a sad state of affairs that a tiny little state like Israel would have to do the tough, heavy lift to help the Western world prevent the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism from acquiring one of the deadliest weapons known to man. But if they have that capability and are willing to use it, then yes, I think that is something we will need to support wholeheartedly here in the United States, because that will be a wholly justified strike under international law. It would be a wholly justified strike under security interests, not just of Israel or the region, but for US citizens and our national security interests long term. And so I believe if in fact the United States turns its back on this and leaves this to Israel to solve, it will be something that will be justifiable and something we will need to support.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question then that says, I'm going to fold two. One, since the deal is crumbling anyway or crumbled anyway, and things have begun to disappear. Is a new bad deal worse than no deal? Is one half of the question. And the other is, would a nuclear Iran mean that other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, would also want nuclear weapons? And so could we be setting up here a regional nuclear arms race?
The latter one is easy, yes. That was true the minute the JCPOA was agreed to and implemented. The idea that we have ceded in the JCPOA Iran an enrichment capacity on its own soil, something we do not do for other countries. In fact, the UAE many years ago signed up to a 123 agreement with the United States. This is an atomic energy cooperation agreement for civil nuclear energy, in which they pledged to hold by what we call the gold standard in US non-proliferation policy, which is no enrichment on your own soil. That nuclear fuel is brought in for your reactor, you don't enrich it yourself because of our concerns of diversion and proliferation. The fact that we reversed the gold standard and allowed Iran to keep enriching on its own soil was a fundamentally fatal flaw of the JCPOA, on top of not fully accounting for their nuclear activities. And so if we return to any such agreement that makes it US policy that Iran is allowed to enrich, and now to enrich to even higher levels while continuing to build out its nuclear infrastructure and its missile infrastructure, you can bet that there will be other countries in the region that are looking to advance clandestinely their own programs. And that will be a major concern to the United States and to Israel.
Thank you. We got a domestic question. Our friend Elon Berman wrote today that domestic inflation, much of which is due to the increase in energy prices, may be one of the drivers of the US position in the talks. If Iran is allowed to flood the market with oil, and they have a lot of oil and they haven't sold it and they haven't been able to sell it, it could lower the price of oil. It could lower US inflation, perhaps in time for the 2022 midterms. Do not say the word 2022 midterms. We don't do politics here. But is it possible that judging US inflation and trying to figure out how to fix US inflation, adding Iranian oil to the international energy mix could be one thing that the administration is thinking?
I don't think so, personally. I think there may be somebody who has asked for a chart to just ask what would happen to the price of oil if we lifted oil sanctions. It's certainly something I've seen in print from pro-JCPOA, pro-Iran deal supporters who have said, oh, by the way, this will be a benefit if you go forward with making a deal and going back and lifting sanctions. But I think it's also for those supporters of the JCPOA who would make this argument, a little bit of a misunderstanding of how the energy market works and responds. If you think that we're going to have some major decrease in the price of oil by lifting these sanctions, you will get a day or two of a bump of some kind downward, but that will be offset over time by overall market pressures and the direction of market forecasts and US policy primarily driving a lot of this with anti-energy regulations. And so what we saw during the Trump administration, because we spent a lot of time on this issue, thinking about what would happen to the oil market if we went all in against Iranian oil, which we did. If the president were to cut off the so-called significant reduction exception waivers under the oil sanctions law that we passed back in 2011. And there were a lot of people who thought that we would spike the price of oil by cutting off 1 million plus barrels per day from Iran. Meanwhile, don't forget, Venezuela was in bad shape with oil exports going down every day. You could always have seen something else happen in the region. Libya was unstable at the time with its oil production. And the idea that we would be continuing to grow in demand. Obviously, we didn't foresee COVID at the time, but the demand would continue to grow from the Chinese would put enormous pressure on the market. And that saying that we were immediately taking oil exports to zero would spike the price of oil. To me, this is the inverse argument, right? And the evidence is that we had about a $5 spike for a day or two, and then it leveled back off. And in fact, oil prices went down. And so what we see is that in understanding of oil as a commodity of the global market, Iranian oil itself is not this major factor for the market that we once thought it was maybe 10 years ago. Today, it's simply not. That has to do with just changes in the dynamic of how oil is coming to market from different countries, including the United States. But I don't believe that we did not see the spike when we cut off the oil, and I don't think we're going to get a dramatic benefit if we lift the sanctions.
Okay. The last kind of folded in series of questions is the non-nuclear aspect. If all of America's attention is in Vienna and is nuclear, is the United States failing to respond or responding badly to a series of non-nuclear issues? Iran is behind a series of conventional threats. There is the Houthi problem, which the White House appears to be very upset by the attack on the UAE, which is appropriate. But nobody at any level that I've heard has mentioned that Iran is the support of the Houthis and needs to be condemned as well. Secondly, there are attempts in Iraq to keep the new government from taking power. Iranian support for Iraqi Shiite militias, which, as you mentioned, have been responsible for American deaths, but also they keep the Iraqi people from having a government. And then there's the problem of Syria. You've got Israel attacking with Russian acquiescence, Iranian assets in Syria. Part of that keeps the international community from doing anything for the Syrian people. So are we ignoring that? Is the US government ignoring that? And should they?
I don't think we're ignoring it. I think we are accepting it right now as a government to our detriment. I think this is a very thought out policy that reverts to where some of these senior officials were at when they left the Obama White House in 2016. Remember, Brett McGurk, who is now sort of the head of all Middle East, North Africa regional policy at the White House, had a similar role in his capacity looking at counter ISIS, et cetera, towards the end of the Obama administration. And it was all part of a strategic framework that emerged from JCPOA that simply said, why are we at this, Cold War that may turn into a hot war with Iran when we have different threats from Sunni Islam? We share common interests in pushing back on those Sunni extremists. We can work together. Our forces are overextended in Iraq and exposed there. We need to treat the Iranians and Hezbollah as potential allies in a war against ISIS and other radical Sunni Islam, and restore some sort of balance of power in the region between our Sunni allies and Iran. Let them have this conflict. This is not our conflict. Why are we inserting ourselves there? If simply we took a more balanced approach, perhaps all sides could at least have some sort of rapprochement and stalemate in the region. And if the Iranians and their militias continue to expand their influence elsewhere, still we will have a partner in counter ISIS and potentially counter Al-Qaeda, even though that is an incredibly flawed assumption given Iran's role as a facilitator and harborer and supporter of Al-Qaeda for many, many years, including today. So yes, the sad fact is that we have given Iran a green light back in the region, even though the Iraqi people have repeatedly, including the last election, tried to reject Iranian influence in their country, even though we know that the stability of Syria long-term relies on removing Iranian forces. And we know that so long as the Houthis are continuing to be armed with missiles and UAVs and other arms from Iran, they will pose direct threats to not just Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also to maritime traffic, as we've seen in the Red Sea. Then we are doing all of these things at our own peril.
Okay, so that's a very depressing answer to the question. We're coming to the end of our program, and people who listen know that I like to end on a positive note. I do not want to send people off thinking the world is ending. So I don't even have a question for you that I think will elicit a positive answer, which is my goal. Do you have anything positive to say as we send our listeners off to have lunch?
I do have one positive thought in mind, and that is this. Something very fundamental has changed in the last 5-6 years since JCPOA that I think will have tremendous impact on the market, even if President Biden lifts sanctions. And that is the Central Bank of Iran, the National Iranian Oil Company, its tanker company, its petrochemical company, 300 or so banks and companies today are designated under US sanctions for their support of terrorism, not the nuclear program, terrorism. And that is a very high bar to reach for the US government to be able to prove and to designate under our sanctions authorities. That takes dossiers of evidence that go through the State Department, the Treasury Department, get cleared by the Department of Justice, and then get announced from either Treasury or State or together. And that's what happened for all of these entities. And there is no evidence today that any of those banks or companies have ceased their support or financing the IRGC or other acts of terrorism. And so what they're negotiating in Vienna is to lift major sanctions. When we talk about oil sanctions being lifted, that's the Central Bank of Iran, it's the National Iranian Oil Company, and its tanker company, all three of which are designated today under terrorism sanctions. And they will be making that agreement without any agreement by Iran to halt its support for terrorism. Which means when you talk to a bank, when you talk to SWIFT, when you talk to a company, when you talk to an investor going forward, you need to let them know that they are knowingly doing business with an entity that is supporting terrorism. And just because the Biden administration has lifted those sanctions for political reasons does not mean that they are going to be free and clear of potentially tripping other legal problems for themselves going forward that a future Department of Justice will pursue. And so the more members of Congress make that clear to the market, the more that the market and other government leaders hear that a potential future president will reimpose sanctions, that Congress will move to reimpose sanctions no matter what, this will be a very big deterrent to the market. There may be spot buyers that buy oil, Chinese will buy oil, others will too, but over the long term, the significant benefits that Iran is hoping for will likely not materialize in time before all of this catches up to companies, investors, insurance companies, tanker companies that have capitulated and agreed to work with financiers of terrorism.
I'm going to accept that as a positive answer. And I'm going to say thank you very much. I think we've learned a lot. Every time we approach this issue of Iran and Iran sanctions, there is more to understand, more to unpack. And you've done a heck of a job bringing us up to date and helping us understand what's happening in Vienna, but more importantly, maybe what's happening in Iran and what's happening in Washington. So Rich Goldberg, thank you. We appreciate having you, and I hope we'll see you again.
Thanks for having me.